All right. Somewhere there's like a red dot or something showing that we're recording.
See it.
Oh, there. I see it. Okay. It took me a while to find it. Today we're going to talk about how to select land. So, or something like that, you know, quest for land. So basically I'm on the phone here with Kyle and Mark, and they have
Hello.
both listened to either all of my
Hello, hello.
podcasts or damn near, right?
That's correct.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And uh, I think we were recording a podcast as part of the Sepulcher stuff or the permaculture smackdown stuff, and
Hmm.
Kyle came up with this idea. Let's travel in this path because apparently I haven't covered this in a podcast. And so while we were preparing for it, it turned out that there's other stuff that I haven't covered in a previous podcast either, which I think is super important stuff along these lines because the mission is like, all right, you're going to make the leap onto land. And as Kyle put it a moment ago, like, I want to know all this stuff so I don't get there and then end up having to move. Because, of course, permaculture is a rather perennial thing. Now, I did write a three-part series. I don't know what this must have been 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. And I shared it with everybody on the Dailyish. Like, hey, everybody on the Dailyish, look at what I wrote, you know, and there it is. And so I don't know if people are ever looked at it ever since, but when Kyle asked this, I pointed it out. And so Kyle, this is the first you've seen of it is when I pointed it out like a couple weeks ago or so.
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, it was a three-part um, series on on exactly what we're talking about now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. To start all this off, there's this very important thing. All people who live in the country are divided into three groups. And I gotta say that this is a great big steaming pile of my opinion, and which is kind of what's being asked for. So forgive my arrogance as I leap into this. These three groups of people are about the same size. Group one, people are happy. They're at least authentically happy or feigning happiness to me. Um, and that means that they get along awesome with all of their neighbors. And they're not getting any trouble from their regional government stuff. And so they're doing everything that they want to do. And it's not like they've got people saying you can't do that. So I believe that within this group of happy people, I'm going to believe maybe a quarter of them or a third of them are authentically through and through happy. And I've been to places where, wow, what a tight knit, beautiful, and wonderful community. It can exist. It is out there. So it is possible. Second group, same size as the first, same size as the third. Second group, unhappy, um, psychotic neighbor. Uh, um, uh, I Mike Oehler had. I mean, I've heard probably 1,000 different hostile, horrible stories, but just as an example, Mike Oehler did not get along with his neighbor. His neighbor owned land uphill of him. They
Ooh.
feuded so much that the neighbor went to the local town, Bonner's Ferry, and apparently got bought one of those RV waste sites where you empty your blue RV liquid of all the poop and urine and all that
Uh-huh.
stuff, and bought one of those, and then proceeded to take what he extracted from that and dumped it on the fence line between his property and Mike's property.
Oh, wow.
and did that for so many years that the water for the whole neighborhood became undrinkable.
Wow.
So now everybody in the neighborhood now has to go and import drinking water. Did I say 1,000 stories? That's just 1,000 stories that people have told me one-on-one. And in this respect, it sort of sucks to be me because these are really depressing stories. And sometimes it's a neighbor who intentionally is very loud just to piss you off, and in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it has to do with the neighbor's dog eating your animals, killing your animals and eating them, and the neighbor saying no, they didn't. They've been locked up over here all day, and it's like, well, I got pictures, and it's like your pictures are fake. Um, those kinds of neighbor. Then, of course, we're all familiar with the Department of Making You Sad, and I gotta. Whenever I say that, I should be saying, you know what? There's a lot of people that work as regulators that I've met that have been terrific, and I've heard a lot of stories from people trying to work with regulators, and the regulators are bending over backwards to try and help them out. And at the same time, we do know of the stories that are not that way. And
Mm-hmm.
I've been and a lot of the stories I hear, like I go to present somewhere and then people are like, can I talk to you after the class? And okay. And I hear the stories, and it's like they try to do a thing and then like grow a garden. No, that's not allowed in this county. You got to be kidding me. Just growing a garden? And it turns out some places it's not allowed. So
Hmm.
and it's kind
Yeah,
of like
those covenants and restrictions can vary a lot based on where you're at.
the stories are painful and massive, and they go, and so it's like goes on and on and on. Group one, happy. Group two, unhappy. Group three, universally used to belong to group two, and they moved, and they selected a place where these kinds of problems are minimized, or more specifically, the problems that they were experiencing are minimized. Typically, they seek property that's at the end of a road, or a property where everything on their property is not visible by their neighbors or by others. And on top of that, these people tend to choose to not develop relationships within 10, sometimes 20 miles of their home. So that way they'll be left alone and they can have peace. I mean, isn't that what a lot of us are seeking? Now, granted, we all want group one. That's what we want. We want to have magnificent neighbors and no problems from the government. And we want everything to be silky smooth all the time. We want it to be just amazing. Um, when I moved on to Mount Spokane, I contacted all of my neighbors and invited them over to my place for a big potluck. It ignited old feuds that I never knew existed until, I mean, I just arrived. I didn't know about these old feuds. And I got to learn I mean, I met some good people, but for every good person, there was probably three that was kind of like fucking nuts. And so, um, and then everyone, sorry, there was a gal in the neighborhood who seemed to have bad things to say about everybody. And it turns out she had a bit of, and she worked as a professional in town. And so you're thinking like, oh, she's an upstanding citizen and everything. And it turns out she's just poisoned through and through. But not only that, she has a bit of a problem with the pharmaceuticals. Her problem with the pharmaceuticals is so powerful that she sneaks into everybody's house on the road to steal their pharmaceuticals.
Wow.
And she gets caught, and she's just, tries to brush it off as if it's nothing. So then there's a guy who has horses, but they're standing around in their own shit, and he has not called a farrier, so they've got like those hooves that kind of curve up. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
Oh, it's horrible. There's channels, farriers have YouTube channels that you can watch, and some of these are really, really rough. They're just ignored for way too long.
And that's the guy that calls the Department of Making You Sad 3 times a week for all the neighbors, turning them in for whatever he can think of. And so
how's that saying go? The fence is a good offense.
Or
keep
I don't know.
Track. They don't see what you're doing.
Somehow you got to work in boredom on this. I mean, what the hell is wrong with this guy? How bored do you have to be? So,
I gotta take that off. I don't want to look at that.
The thing is nobody was calling the Department of Making You Sad on this guy, because they had their own lives to live, and they're trying to do their own things. But suddenly here comes all this other stuff, So all I'm saying is that there's 3 groups, and so I thought it was so I think it's important. I think there's a lot of people, we've got to have respect for this, because in a lot of ways I'm trying to do that where I am now. Part 3, group 3, live at the end of a road and just keep to myself and not develop a lot of relationships within 10 or 20 miles. And it's like, instead, I love Missoula, Montana. I love Missoula. I love to develop relationships in Missoula. And so Missoula is a wonderful community. But even more than that, there's a whole lot of people that are here now. I think there's 15 of us that are here on my property right now. So we have our own little community. We have lots of community right here, right now. So I kind of feel like our community needs are being met as is. Now, granted, when I was down Mount Spokane and I got to know some people, developing those relationships makes it so it's so much easier to live in the country when you develop those relationships with the good people. Because the good people are like when I had these 2 old tractors, and some people wanted to borrow the tractors, and they were really good mechanics, and so they would get these tractors working and then use them and return them in better shape than they borrowed them. And it's like there were a lot of great relationships, but it's like, in the end, the downsides were like 4 times more than the upsides. So that's an element when to think about when looking for land. I don't know. I whenever I mention this stuff and people have not bought their land yet, then they are certain that they're going to be in the first group. They're going to pick a place where everybody is wonderful. All their neighbors are fantastic. Everything is great. And of course, we're going to get into this in a little bit, but there's also something to be said for, well, if you're going to go into this area and you're going to go get some acres, what's the price per acre in this neighborhood where everybody is wonderful and the government is decent? Do you guys want to make an estimate? Go ahead.
Well, depending on the size that you're looking at, right? The cost per acre tends to go up the fewer acres you're dealing with. But if you're talking about agricultural land and versus sloped land, and I think it also depends too on what your goals are. When you talk about people being group 1, right, and being happy, well, how are you going to be happy? And like with neighbors, it's I think pretty rare, unless your neighbors each have 1,000 acres and you only have 3 or 4 neighbors, that you're always going to run into the crazy one, right? Or just somebody
Sure.
who is going to be diametrically opposed. Is that the right word? Diametrically, that are the sort of the complete opposite of you, personality-wise. That it doesn't matter what you're doing, the two of you just aren't going to get along. And so you get enough people around you, you're eventually going to run into that individual. And unfortunately, if that individual doesn't have anything better to do, then that could be their form of entertainment. You talk about like, how's this guy, calling up the department and making you sad on all of his neighbors all the time. It's like, well, that could be a person's form of entertainment. Instead of watching TV, they just like to harass other people in whatever form it is. In this case, calling the codes department.
I'm going to say that if you go to if you're group A and it's authentic, everything is dreamy and smooth. The people in the area are just terrific. What a lovely group. It's paradise. I think you're looking at $10,000 to $20,000 per acre for like 10 to 80 acres, something like that. I think that when you get to some place where the neighbors are generally more problematic, the price per acre is going to go down a lot because the people are trying to get out of there. They're like, I'm trying to move, and there's a lot of different people that are trying to leave that area. And
you still there, Paul?
I'm still here.
I hear you fine.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to say that here in Montana, it's like, yeah, you can get land that's $1,000 an acre, and we'll talk about that. But I think one of the things that brings the price way down is going to be that it's more likely to be group 2, and so if you wanna try and get that to work, you probably should be looking at group 3 strategies.
Yeah.
And then, if you've got the money for it, then by all means, take a look at a group 1. Now, at the same time, I have seen land where it's like, okay, here's a plot of land, and it's 20 acres, and it comes with a 3-bedroom house, and and I would estimate that it's worth $250,000, but the guy's trying to sell it for $750,000, and it's been on the market for 7 years. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, and I think his policy is that he really doesn't want to sell the land, but if somebody came along and offered him $750,000, he'd take it. And at the same time, this is an important one. I remember when I lived on Mount Spokane, there was a property at the base of the road, and I think it was like 60 acres, and it had a homestead and a bunch of outbuildings and stuff like that. And a lot of times when you're going to go and buy rural land, you cannot get a bank to carry it. You cannot get a mortgage. And so owner financing is pretty common. And the normal thing that you do is it's going to be 1/3 down, and then a normal interest rate as if it was a bank, so something on the order of like 5%. And so this guy sold the property, and the people paid 1/3 down, and they made their mortgage payments for a while. And then something happened, like living out in the country, that turns out they couldn't pull it off. And so he foreclosed. He got it back. And apparently he sold this same property that way 6 times.
Wow.
Wow.
What a, and apparently, the lesson here is like, if you're going to go buying property, you better be careful of this kind of thing. And on top of that, maybe don't do a mortgage, because if you're going to do a mortgage, part of it is the whole concept of like, now you got to go get a worky job and keep working that worky job to pay the mortgage. And so
Yeah.
that could be a dangerous thing, especially if you're in group one and the cost of that property was like $3 million.
Right.
It's like, oh shit. Okay.
Yeah, that or one of your goals is to make money on the property, and particularly if you're not already making money that way.
True. Then,
well, I'm gonna, raise sheep or cattle and make my money to pay the bills that way. And it's like, yeah, that can be a tough way to learn, the hard way usually. That it's, like you said, either purchase it up front or have some other way to make money. But on NPR yesterday, they had the agriculture secretary on, and he mentioned it. I think the number was, it was either 86.9 or 89.6% of all farmers do not make most of their money by farming, that they have another job or some other source of income that actually paid the bills, that it's a little over 10% of farmers can actually make their living as farmers and not need to do something else. So when somebody goes to buy a property and their plan is, well, I'm going to pay all my bills by what I grow on that land or raise on that land, that can be very difficult.
I agree. And I think there was a fascinating story, which I hope I put into a podcast years and years ago, about a couple that were all about everything organic. And they moved to an area where the big regional crop was cherries. And so they bought a cherry orchard, and they arrived saying, we are going to do strictly organic because these are our values, these are our standards. And then they found themselves like 6 years later, and he couldn't do it. I mean, the wife kind of was partially involved, but it was mostly the guy, mostly the husband. He was like, he tried and tried and tried. So basically it's like they did something similar. In order to be able to get by, they're kind of like they went conventional. And so they're spraying and stuff. And the thing is that a lot of money passed through their fingers, but at the end of the year, they went into the red every year. And so it's like, you get all your cherries, and then you get to the warehouse, and that's when you find out how much money you're going to get paid for all your cherries. And then they take your cherries, and then they save them, and they do this and they do that and whatever. And then, so they paid you money for the cherries, and then they took money out of that for doing all the things that they do to sell your cherries. And for half the people, they ended up like that transaction alone was in the negative. Like the amount being paid for the cherries was small, and then the amount being paid for them to do all the things that they have to do to sell the cherries was high and was bigger than the amount that they'd get paid for the cherries. So it's like they owed money. They delivered cherries, and because they delivered cherries, they now owed money to that organization. And so my impression was that the wife had a job which was basically paying for the husband to make a go out of conventional cherry orcharding. And so it's like and that's a very common story. I hear that a lot. Like with wheat, you drop off your wheat and you get paid this small amount, and they store your wheat. And then the first wheat they sell is for their friends or for themselves. Your wheat just sits in the silos, and then you pay rent on that silo until your wheat is sold.
Wow.
And so it's like some people are making money and some people are not. And And I think this is a great time to mention, I love what Joel Salatin says about those people have an unfair advantage. And what you really need to do is create your own unfair advantage. All right. Yes, I think that, and I kind of feel like it comes back to mortgage free, where mortgage free, the thing is you gotta buy the land outright. No mortgage. You know, you
Yeah.
gotta, if you don't have enough to buy the land outright, you keep you keep living humbly until you have it. And then you buy the land outright. Not, don't do the mortgage thing. None of that. So, all right.
Okay.
Kyle, you now have the steering wheel. This was your idea to have this podcast, and I can't remember what I have and have not talked about in past podcasts. So
Okay.
you have the steering wheel. What are we talking about now?
So I've got some notes um, from your articles, and I just kind of made an outline of them. I think we just start at the beginning and go through that, and then we could go to my specific situation after that.
Okay. So the first
Um,
thing is how many acres?
the first thing you talk about is how many acres, and you start your calculation um, with having a herd of cows.
Right.
And
So
then with a small herd of cows, I think it was 5, you calculated that you'll need 80 acres.
true. That is true. So then I think it's fair to say, do you like beef? Do you like dairy? Things of that nature. Is that going to be part of your diet? Is that going to be part of what you're doing? Is cattle? And so I also feel like it's 80 acres in the kind of climate where I want to live. So a colder climate. Um, I mean, I think that's another. I'm sure in past podcasts I've talked about when I go to select land, I want forested slope. I do not want
Yeah.
flat, and
Yeah.
I want a colder climate so I can build the soil. So,
Okay.
all right. So if I'm going to be in this colder climate with slope, and I'm going to want to at least have the option to have cattle someday, then the
Right.
bare minimum is 80 acres. Now,
Okay.
you're reading that. Both of you have, I'm guessing, read this and understood it. This is a great time
Yeah.
to contest my math.
Well, your 80 acres is including that you're going to be growing hay that you'll bale and store for winter feeding. And maybe you're slaughtering one of those cows each year and, butchering it for your meat needs for the year. And if you're going to get 200 or 300 pounds of meat of various cuts from one of those animals.
I'm saying that if you like, raising one cow is inappropriate, and
Right, right.
and the minimum grouping is 5. And so if you're going to travel this path, and then this is without importing hay, I mean, that can be very problematic. If you're going to buy your hay, then that opens the door for a lot of problems. So then you want to be self-sustaining. Then then you're going to do that part yourself, and then I mean that opens up a lot of different doors on how you go about it. Are you gonna bale it or not, and things of that nature.
Right. Because now you have to get hardware, machinery to do that. Unless somebody's going to be
Or
out there with super strong arms and a scythe,
well, and that is a way that's done. I lean more in the general direction of going hayless, and so in which case, if you're transitioning towards hayless, maybe you're going to have still some hay, enough hay for just a few months out of the winter instead of 6. Um, you know, paths like that. But the thing is that it's like, okay, if you're going to do beef and or dairy, or you want to at least have that option, then it's 80 acres. Now, Kyle,
Yes.
my memory is that you're not a beef eating kind of guy.
I'm not. No. I'm.
So
I guess we're getting at that. I am a vegan, and we had you've talked before about, and I understand the concept that that vegans would do well to have um, ruminants rotationally grazing on their land, and I'm inclined to agree with that. But if you want, do you want to talk about that for a minute,
well,
or do you?
I would think that what would be a great fit for a vegan is to um, I mean, I kind of feel like, all right, I've got like 170 things rolling around in my head at once.
Uh-huh.
I think community. I want there to be 200 acres, and I want there to be, like at least 8 families on that plot, and maybe 1 or 2 of those families will be vegan, and then other families, one of the families will keep some cattle, and they'll move the cattle around the whole plot, the whole property. Um, and that I think that the vegans would benefit from that, even if they're not going to partake in that in the beef or the dairy. There's also vegetarians, and there's all kinds of different dietary choices. And I think another thing
Right.
to keep in mind is that people's dietary choices tend to change throughout their lives for reasons. All that said, I kind of feel like that's where I'm going. Is I would choose to move towards community. I think that's the smart play. Like even if we're gonna talk about gratitude, I believe that Gert is like she's got her 2.5 acres in the middle of a shared property thing. That's
Yeah.
that's what I think. But for a lot of people that are listening to this, they're thinking to themselves like, no, I'm looking for property that's just for me and mine, and not a bunch of other people. And it's like, okay, that's I think that's what this podcast is for, right? Not like for people that are looking for their land, but not community, for their own thing. Am I right on that?
No.
Oh,
I would like our kind of general plan is to have our land and then our community that follows that kind of in a way mirroring what you have going on, whereas I have, what you have going on is you have these your ethics and your goals, and you know that it will take community. So you went ahead and bought the land, and you're attracting people that want to live your style of community instead of trying to go out and find your specific style of community.
right.
Is so ours is pretty similar to yours. Um, uh, our our ethics and goals and needs and wants, but not exactly aligned with yours. So we're trying to find, if we can, a larger plot, um, and invite people that share our specific ethics and needs and wants and aesthetic and all those things to come live on it afterwards. But yeah,
So exactly the same, but 2 steps to the left.
yes,
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Understood. All right.
2 states to the left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's that too. So slightly
Would you
different
say that
climate.
you were talking about the, raising ruminants on that land? even though you're vegan, would it be an option of where, say, you find someone else who wants to have those cattle, but they could keep them on your property? Like I knew a couple that, I forget if they had, I think it was maybe just 10 acres, but it's possible it was 20. But about half of that, they would essentially raise cattle for a third party, and they would show up and have their 20 or 30 calves, and they had electric fence around, I think it was about a half acre sections. And every day the cattle would have access to one of those sections, and maybe 2 days. And then they would get moved to the next section, which had grass that was a foot tall. So the cows would go crazy on that and start to eat it down. And then they'd go through at least a dozen of these before they got back to the original one. So there'd be like 2 weeks worth of growth. And they would do that from spring to fall. And then the owner of those cattle would show up with their truck, pick them all up. And as payment, this couple was given one of those cows that would get butchered for them. And then they would, here's your 300 pounds of meat. And overall, the amount of time spent wasn't that high, essentially just moving the cows from one section to the next every day or two. And that worked as far as, they were paid with meat. In your case, you'd be paid in cash or something along those lines. Would that be one of the options you consider? Because otherwise, if you're not
I don't think so.
cattle,
I don't think that's within our ethics.
Okay.
Okay.
But would you have other people in the community you're looking at that would be doing that? Or is the goal that everybody that you would be bringing to that property would also be vegan, or that you just wouldn't be raising animals for slaughter?
I don't know yet. In an optimum world, in an optimal world, everybody's vegan. But yeah, in our little community, I don't think we would force anyone to be to adhere to our dietary restrictions. But at the same time, I don't think allowing the use of our land for things that are against our ethics would be acceptable.
Right.
Okay. I'm gonna move on to a slightly different angle of how many acres.
Okay.
And I'm gonna say I believe that a small adult who works full time at growing their own food without importing anything can take a quarter of an acre, and in time, like after 10 years, get that quarter of an acre to the point that it'll produce enough food to feed that person, that one person. Enormous amount of work that ongoing every year. At the
Right.
same time, if you set up a single acre using permaculture techniques, I think with very little effort, it'll provide enough food for one person. And I keep thinking that 1 acre is about right for the amount of food to feed one person in general using permaculture techniques. But that doesn't give you any room for other things, like, do you need wood for not only heat, but also possibly for building certain things? Or, wood's a very valuable material for all kinds of stuff. And then the other thing is that I think that if you had 2 acres per person, it would probably be even easier still, and it would not be as cramped. So now if you're going to talk about having a family The question is well, how big of a family? Now, so like let's say that you've got 4 people, and then you've got possibly, rather than 2 acres per person, which would be 8 acres, it's more like 7 or 6 acres. That should be quite comfortable for a family. 6 or 7 acres would be quite comfortable to grow all the food without imports, which I think is important to keep in mind, because of course there are people that have grown enough food to feed 2 or 3 people on a quarter of an acre, but they had a lot of imports. They brought in
Yeah.
a lot of fertilizers, a lot of manures, a lot of this and that and the other thing. So without imports. So I kind of feel like an acre, yes, that's comfortable. More than an acre, a little more comfortable still. So next thing, what are your neighbors like? And I kind of feel like I've heard this story a lot, where all 100% of your next door neighbors are sprayers, and
Yeah.
so and it
That was next
drifts,
on the list.
and so then it's kind of like, all right, let's suppose you go out and you get your land, and you've decided that about 7 acres is about right for you, and it's kind of like, how much buffer do you need on your property to try to buffer you from your neighbors? And I mean, I think that for a lot of people, they're going out and buying their own land and growing their own food because the stuff that you can get at Whole Foods, it says organic, but is it really? What is the
Right.
story with that? And it's like,
legally,
there's, yeah, well, and maybe
not,
even
but not
not.
literally. True.
Organic according to Monsanto.
Organic according to Monsanto, and at the same time, did the grower take some shortcuts? You know, I remember
Right.
a story where a person was trying to do the right thing and visit with their farmers. Like they wanted to know where their food came from and get an understanding of their values. And it's like, it sounded like the farmer had the right values. And so they visited and it sounded like everything was just great. And then they heard the farmer talking to somebody else about like yellow jackets. And then it's like, oh yeah, nothing works except for raid, you know, just poison those motherfuckers. And so then it turned out that also when it came to ornamentals, they had no problem using Roundup. And so I kind of feel like so many people are all about organic, except, you know, when they spray. So for
Yeah.
the 362 days out of the year that they don't spray, they're organic. And then the few times that they do spray, well, you know, what are you going to do? But hey, they're mostly organic.
Yeah.
And I've heard these same people say, oh, we're better than organic, but they spray. And it's kind of like, where the fuck do you think you're organic at all? And so I kind of have to wonder when you go and you get the food, and it's kind of like, well, when you buy the food at Whole Foods, you know it was grown in a monocrop, and that's contrary to my values. I wish to have food that's grown in a polyculture. Okay, so you're going to buy this land with the idea of growing something better. You want to know the story of your food. It's important.
Yes.
And then it's like, next thing you know, you're on this land and shit keeps happening, and you find that you're cutting corners a lot. And part of it is your neighbor sprays, and then it comes onto your land. Sometimes they have a little extra spray, so they just kind of shoot it out your way because there's a bunch of weeds on your land that they can see, and they can spray it a good 25 feet off of their wagon, and they're like thinking to themselves, I'm helping this guy out because he's clearly got a lot of weeds over there. I can
Oh,
see him.
nice.
I'm going to give him a little extra, do a little more for him. And that'll help make it so that there's a little less of his shit storm coming on to my monocrop. And
Yeah.
so they're helping you and helping themselves at the same time by spraying your land for free, no charge, buddy. I'm helping you out. You owe me one now. And so, let alone the overspray, which is just like, they go to spray and a lot of it just comes. So now your stuff is tainted. And it's kind of like,
not only spray, but you can also have, surface water runoff that is picking up those sprays and any other things that they're putting into the soil. So you have to also worry about what the water is bringing onto your land from your neighbors as well.
Well, yeah. Why is it that on the uphill side of my property, all I can grow is grass? Well, most of the herbicides are broadleaf herbicides. And
Yes.
so they kill everything except grass. And so it's like, okay, well, I had all these trees up there, but they're all dead now. And I tried growing legumes, but they all died. All that grows is grass. That's all. Why? And it's exactly what Mark is saying. And so, but even more than that, if it's a persistent herbicide, you go and you do chop and drop. You're going to I'm going to go cut all that grass. And now I'm going to go lay the grass as a mulch over on my garden over here. And then your garden dies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like, I bought this property. I moved my family. It's now a pain in the ass to get to work. I did all of this so I could just know the story of my food. And it turns out I am now poisoning everything more than if I just kept buying shit at Whole Foods. And I think that this kind of story is the story, a big part of the story about how that guy sold that same property 6 times. Is that people would come and they would try to grow all this stuff and it wouldn't grow. And they learned more than they ever wanted to learn about all this stuff. And then they just were like, fuck it. And they walked away from the property and they just went back to work in town. And so, all right. The question is how many acres? We're talking about how many acres. And it's like, okay, a person's looking for 7 acres. And what I'm trying to say is you might need a sacrifice buffer around your property.
Right.
And how big of a sacrifice buffer you might need might change from property to property.
And
so suddenly it's now you need 20 acres.
If there's nobody spraying there now, who's to say what's going to happen in 5 years down the road?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you can have a buffer like a hedgerow of some sort, like you said, you still don't know in the future if somebody's going to show up and poison those plants with good intentions. But if you do have that hedgerow on a property you're looking at, then one, you know that there isn't those broadleaf herbicides in play already. And two, if anything is sprayed on occasion for dealing with whatever the neighbor's dealing with, that you do have that sort of a windbreak that will sort of limit how far onto your property that is going to travel.
Next thing is going to be like most of your properties are going to be like next to a road of some kind. And maybe it's a dirt road, maybe it's a paved road. But I know that for a while I was doing some community living in Washington State, and it was on a dirt road. And it's like there must have been 40 hillbillies living further down the road, and they would just race their rigs, by the house. And man, it's like if you're trying to get your zen on, you're like trying to think like, oh, I've got this beautiful sanctuary and this happiness, or I'm gonna make this video of this butterfly, and then there's this roaring engine, and it's kind of like, all right, so you need a big ass fucking berm right there. That's and hey, you guys have been here. What'd you see I have next to the county road?
Yeah.
Get
Big
that
ass fucking berm.
those
So
Not
well-built
only
berm
not only the
sheds as
audio,
well.
yeah, the berm shed, and you also get that blocking of sight, so the neighbors that drive by, they just
And
see this plain looking hill, and they don't get inquisitive as to, oh, is that a pile of something laying there close enough I can go grab it while no one's looking? So you get a little bit of privacy.
no, yeah. When we first got here and before we put the berms up, we had people stealing things, and then talking about Department of Making You Sad, the fish and game guy lived down the road farther, and he always slowed down to go by our property to look at whatever we were doing. And one day we were out there uh, processing a pig, and he stopped right where we were, like on the county road, blocking the county road. He just stopped right there, and he sat there for 5 minutes, and we just continued processing the pig. And then eventually he rolled down his window and shouted out, "What kind of animal is that? Pig?" He rolls up his window, sat there for another 5 minutes, and then drove off. But it's like we put up the berm, all these weird little things that kept happening, all these little small hostilities and all kinds of stuff stopped. I don't know. There's just nothing to see. People are bored,
Yeah.
and I think that's part of it. Be boring, and they go right on by. But what I'm trying to get is we're trying to talk about acres. How many acres do you want? And it's like a berm takes up some serious real estate. So if you're going to have a berm, you better be planning on a big chunk of land right there. That's where I'm getting at. That's what I'm trying to say. Is like, okay, hey, look, I found this beautiful property. It's 4 acres next to this busy road, and it's kind of like you're going to lose an acre and a half just to the berm, And plus, the other thing is this, like, if you're trying to live somewhere for greater values, I would say the quiet is a value.
Absolutely.
And I would say that at this time, exhaust from automobiles might be part of the value. Now, if people are driving by and the road is like, let's say the road is a quarter of a mile away, and they're driving by, but 90% of the people that are driving by have been driving for already at least 10 minutes. With a gasoline vehicle, the catalytic converter is now warmed up so much that the amount of exhaust coming from that car that as a pollutant to you is very small. Like I remember the whole thing about like a lawnmower on average puts out more pollution than like 7 cars or something like that, because the car has the catalytic converter, and once it gets heated up, then it's burning off a lot of the pollutants. But the lawnmower is not, the gasoline lawnmower. Now, of course, hopefully someday more cars will be electric and there'll be less pollution and stuff like that. It's less of a concern. But there's still the thing about the sound, about the noise of the cars going by, let alone other kinds of issues.
When I was out at Wheaton Labs, I was camping up on the volcano, and it is so much louder up when you're higher than the berms.
Yeah.
When you walk down to base camp, it is so much more quiet.
Yeah. And we're going to try and fix that someday.
Oh, really?
Well, we will introduce more berms, so that way when you put a tent on that spot, then it'll be quieter.
Oh.
We'll put up some hugelkultur, some berms, etc. in time.
Excellent.
Yeah, there were a couple of properties that I was looking at that were otherwise ideal as far as 20 acres of heavily wooded property that was right off of a paved road. So you didn't have to worry about like, oh, I might need 50 feet of gravel to wherever I want to park the car, but it was otherwise good access. And I remember walking one of those properties, and that particular road was the primary route that a bunch of timber companies used for their trucks. And here come one of these loaded trucks by, whoa, as it's doing engine braking or whatever. And the noise was just terrific, terrifically loud, I should say. And just realizing like it didn't matter where you were on those 20 acres, it would sound like somebody was driving 20 feet away from you when they'd go by. And it's like, yeah, hearing that 50 times a day, it would just drive you nuts. You wouldn't want to be there anymore. So that peace and quiet for me was a big factor when I was looking for property.
Another one that I've heard from a lot of different people is, somebody in the neighborhood has teenagers with dirt bikes, and then the wintertime they do the snowmobiles, and so you're trying to get your zen on, and there's this. So, all right, the question on the table is how many acres, and I think that if we're going to talk about an average family of say 4, I would say you're going to start with 4 acres. You can go up to 7 to be it makes it a little bit easier to grow all the food that you're going to need and all the other things you're going to want from acreage. And then add in your buffer from your neighbors and the many flavors of buffer that you might need or want. I think now we're talking about something closer to 15 acres. And so so an average family, we're looking at 15 acres. Now, all that said, a slight difference is like, okay, here at my place, I offer an acre of deep roots, and that's kind of like our basic package. But at the same time, there's community acres that could be used for growing food, and we try to encourage a lot of food that's more uh, like forage gardening, that style. I'm sure you guys heard that podcast where we came up with this term forage gardening.
Yes.
Yeah, and so encourage a lot of that. But we also have had people doing deep roots where they've gotten 2 or 3 acres. And I think what we do is we sell the deep roots for 3 acres of deep roots for the price of 2 acres. And that's a smart way to go. But most people get their deep roots plot in a place where there's room to expand later. Because that's another problem that you kind of face, is that when you first get started with growing a garden, if you have many acres, it's we call it the abyss, and then you end up not growing any garden at all because you're trying to garden the entire plot, and you end up being spread too thin. And it's like you really got to focus on your first year. Do not try to grow a garden on more than a quarter of an acre, and then each year you can expand that garden. And so I kind of feel like an acre is a great place to start. And when you've got an acre and you're doing it on your own, it's kind of like, wow, this is a lot of land. this is
It is, yeah.
enormous.
You really want to focus on. You want to focus on like your zone 1 space, and then develop that.
Yeah, and it's like, and put 90% of your effort on your quarter acre zone 1, and then the rest of it gets 10% of this and that for whatever reason. Too often people try to, like, I've got 3 acres, and they try to spread it evenly across the whole 3 acres. And it's like, oh geez, no, it's not gonna work. You're gonna be sad. It's gonna be frustrating. How many acres? All right, so there you go. If there's cattle, minimum of 80. I'm going to advocate community. And so I would even, I think in this article, I think in the end, I said I prefer something about 200 acres. And, but 80 is a minimum. Now I'm not allowed to eat beef. Someday I might be allowed to eat beef again. But gallstone stuff. But um, for now, I'm not allowed to eat beef. The but the thing is that when I am allowed to eat beef, I do eat beef. Um, all right, what do you guys think? What are your opinions on acres?
Uh, I've been looking at places. I set my minimum to 5 acres when I do a search. You get a lot more. There's a lot of places like that are just divided into 5 acre plots. Um, but yeah, I hear what you're saying about when thinking about having a community and all our buffers and everything. It seems that that 5 acre plot, when we look at it, it's got to be perfect. Um, we look at the neighbors and kind of estimate if, like, are they spraying? Is it like timber company property where they spray, but they spray once in 30 years or something like that? And when was that? When are they going to do it again? Um,
I think
yeah,
most timber companies do not spray.
we had a we were looking at a property and we were very excited about it, and it fell through for other reasons, but it backed up against and was downhill from a plot of land that had been cut, I think, 4 years before.
Mhm.
And we contacted the timber company and asked them, um, and it was the major one, at least in the Pacific Northwest. And they were very nice, and they told us, well, they sprayed there right after it was cut, and then they won't spray again until the next time it is cut, and that was, I think, 30 years or 20 years up the road. Was their
So
response
Yeah.
on that specific property.
There were some that did spray and some that didn't when I was talking to the realtor in the area. And so, yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, these two companies, they spray after they cut, and then these other 3 or 4 don't. So, yeah, it is hit or miss. You have to do your research on that if you're going to be nearby that property.
So my impression is that near roads they will spray, and a lot of times it's for legal reasons, like they're being legally required to spray because an herbicide company pushed some law through and
Mm.
also pushed through enforcement of that law.
Oh yeah, the nature conservatory, or whatever that group is pretty much been overtaken by Monsanto
Oh
people.
yeah.
Push spraying on everything.
The of
Got to
course the
protect
Nature
certain
Conservancy
bits.
is not a timber company, but yeah, the Nature
Right.
Conservancy, it's like, well, we got $1 billion from all these people that have given us all this money. We're going to buy some land and then we'll spend about just as much money buying herbicides
Yeah.
because it's free money. And we don't have a business model other than to just buy land and we've decided to fear plants, and so we're going to just poison the fuck out of everything, and then we'll feel better. And the plants that we don't like will mysteriously die, and the plants that we do like will thrive and be happy despite being poisoned because of wishful thinking and because we spent good money on it. It's bizarre how much they spray. It's just uncanny, the
Yeah.
obscene amount that they spray. But a timber company is like, are you kidding me? That shit costs money. What the fuck would we want to pay that for? No way.
Yeah, I got the feeling as they spray right after they cut just to keep any of the pioneer species down so they can come in and put in their Doug firs and they'll have a leg up and then just they just kind of let them go.
So yeah, that is a strategy for some of them. And anyway, all right.
Now, another
The
variable too is the shape of the plots that you're looking at. So, like, say you find a 10-acre plot, but it's 200 feet by however many, I guess it would be 2,000 feet, right? You could have a 10-acre plot that's in those kind of proportions, and now you're not many feet away from a neighbor on either side. And then when you're dealing with noise or overspray of herbicides, things like that, or that road, you could lose a lot more usable space on your property depending on that shape. Ideally you get the perfect square, or in a weird world, I guess, a perfect circle that they would sell property in, but then you still have access roads and all that. So just that acreage number might not be accurate, depending on it, because there was a lot of properties I looked at that were really thin slices, and because they had that frontage, small frontage to a road, and then you're going back, hundreds and hundreds of feet. So the acres were okay, but the actual usable space, like, a golfer could hit a ball over your property and not, hit it at all when the ball landed, that type of thing.
So I think a good thing to point out is that the guy that's over on Orcas Island, I remember reading this story years and years ago, and he built a goat shed, and it was apparently a pretty small shed, but he spent 3 years in court over this goat shed. And so the thing is that the goat shed, which he built one day, and it wasn't much of a shed. It was just like, I want my goats to be a little drier, and it could be seen from the road. And so the once he built it, somebody drove by and saw it and called it in. Like, that shouldn't be there. They shouldn't have done that. They're like, do they have a permit to build that house? Does it have a septic system? And it's like, it's just a shed. It's not even tall enough for a person to stand up in. And 3 years, 3 years over a tiny little goat shed. So
I believe it.
all right. That makes, because the reason why I bring that up is, like, even if you get your acres, and so you're talking about that long skinny property, or you're talking about, something that's in the 5 to 15 acres range, it's kind of like, can people see onto your property? And one of the things I kind of wanted to mention was the whole thing about when Sepp Holzer was in Montana a few years ago. He was in Bozeman, and we're at this property in Bozeman, and I know that I did a big podcast about it at the time, but they wanted to build a pond, and in the end they decided, so here's Sepp Holzer ready to build a pond. He wants to build a pond, and then the landowner, lost their courage at the last minute, because they kind of thought, we're going to get into so much trouble if we build this pond. And their concern is that right over there, about a quarter mile away, was a neighbor who had a 2-story house, and that person could look from their second story over and see a pond and call it in. And the suggestion that I made, which they didn't do, was, like, to first build a berm right there along their own fence line, so it's well within their own property, this nice big berm, and then the pond would go right next to the berm. So even if they're on the roof of that house, they would not see a pond, because the issue with the pond is going to be, A, is it better to ask forgiveness than permission? And if the pond is small enough, then that is universally the case. And B, the only reason you will need to ask forgiveness is if somebody calls it in. And if they can't see it, they can't call it in. So that was, but now we're back to the thing of like, is your property going to have any ponds on it? And as permaculturalists, we're like kind of a little crazy about ponds. Like, yeah, we want a lot of ponds. And so it's like, okay, we got to calculate that into the acreage as well. And then it's kind of like, do we need to make it so that people can't see the pond? And we have to add some more berms. That's going to take some acreage also. All right. So, Kyle, you were talking about your acreage and what you think is a good number. Mark, do you have a number for acreage?
Personally, I like the idea of being able to build or grow that hedge around your property to limit, sight lines as well as other things. But yeah, I mean, as far as what's needed for actual production, like if I'm growing my own food, I wouldn't be raising animals, perhaps some chickens, but that would be probably the extent of what I would do. But I'd be, heating with wood and wanting to set up either a large enough woodlot or something that can be coppiced over time. So personally, I was looking at 20 acres when I was looking around, and a lot of that had to do with the shape of the lots tended to be rectangles, and you would get, say, a 600-foot by 1,600-foot space, which I thought was a good amount that, I could plant a variety of trees and shrubs around the perimeter, so that a person can't see more than, say, 150 feet in. And then you still end up having, that middle half of the property as a strip that you could build whatever you wanted to. But that's still a problem, because who's to say somebody doesn't, get a drone for Christmas and they're flying around and then they see something that wasn't there before. They don't have to get real close to see a building or a pond or whatever else. So yeah, I mean, 20 acres seemed like a good round number. And there's lots of parcels that are sold that way, typically because they're bought and sold by timber companies after they've harvested, and they don't want to hold on to that. They'll try to sell it to somebody for twice the act.
Right. And they're patient. They'll put a price on it. It's like, this is the price that, we think will get this property to sell in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And so we'll wait for the market to kind of go up and down, and we'll catch it when it's up. They're really, really patient in that way. All right. So you were looking for 20, and Kyle, sounded like you were looking more in the 15 area.
Yeah. Sounds about right.
Okay. So, and then now I'm advocating a colder climate, sloped land. But Kyle, it sounds like you're going to go for something that's a colder climate but warmer than what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. I'm looking in the Pacific Northwest, mostly west of the Cascades.
Kind of like the Seattle area.
Yeah.
So like, for those people that aren't too familiar with Washington State, it's like the left third of the state is what you think of when you think of some soggy stuff. The middle third of the state, maybe even a little bit more, is desert. I mean, like, think tumbleweeds.
Yeah.
And then the right edge of the state, like maybe a fifth, is like the very beginning. It's like the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and it's starting to green up again.
Yeah, out near Spokane,
Yeah,
and
Spokane
as
is
you're, and then when you get into Idaho, then it starts being a big Rocky Mountain area. That's really nice.
right, right. Then you get to Montana. So, but you're looking for the leftist third, which is going to
Yeah,
be generally pretty soggy. I mean, there are a couple of authentic rainforests in there.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and um, all right. So, but that's that area. It's like in the wintertime. For most winters, the coldest temperature you'll see is like 10 or 15 degrees.
Right.
And the other thing is that to me, it's disgusting in the wintertime. Everything is covered in a green slime. Um, and I don't know. Some people are into that, but
I'm into that.
to me, it's like most of the apple trees that you see there are covered in lichen and mosses, and they tend to have a poor leaf count as the tree is struggling with problems with insects and funguses and all kinds of apple trees do so in the region. Um, uh,
Mhm.
and so legit, you're gonna own that, Kyle, or should we have a little talk right now?
Um, well, there's a lot of other reasons for us to stay in the area. Um,
Oh no, legit, no problem there, no problem. I'm
yeah,
just trying to say, like, horticulturally, it's kind of like, man, I love a good apple tree, but the apple trees, it's like, boy, you're gonna have to put some extra work in there in order for the apple trees to be a little happier. And it's, it's not a huge amount, but you're gonna want to take a little more care. There are
okay.
some things that
Hopefully
grow.
by default,
There's
as
some
I say,
things that
hopefully
grow
by
that.
default though, it'll be better care taken just because of a permaculture mindset too
Yeah.
on that property. The average apple tree out there in its monoculture type of setup doesn't fare so well, but hopefully Kyle's would.
You can grow fig trees where you are. I can't.
Hmm.
I mean, like, you can grow fig trees outside. People here grow fig trees in greenhouses. Um, but I hope to be able to someday grow a fig tree using nothing but microclimates, but that's another story for another day. Um, at the same time, if you build a hugelkultur, like my hugelkultur will last 4 times longer than yours.
Yeah,
Yeah. So because the difference of, like, you're in a cold area, but mine is colder. So, all
right.
right. We're talking about how to select land. And as a permie, I think that these are some of the metrics that are, there's a reason why I live in Montana, or why I choose to live in Montana. I want something inland, more inland than where you're looking. All right.
Okay.
What's, so have we talked enough about acres? Should we move on to
I
the
think
next
so.
piece? What are we talking
I
about
think
next?
so. I had one other thing written down. 80 acres for a cattle herd. What about and the benefit of having ruminants on your property? Is it the same 80 acres for goats or for sheep,
No.
or
Oh
is
no,
is
no,
it
it's much
is it
less.
quite is it much less?
Yeah. Yeah. Although I think when contemplating a homesteading lifestyle, a lot of people think that they want to get goats. It's like, oh, I'll be able to milk them, and it's like, I hope you. I mean, it's possible that the goat milk that they've been enjoying was not fed. The goats were not fed what goats are intended to eat. But if you take a goat and you feed it what dairy cows eat, you get a milk that tastes like the milk from a dairy cow. or more like the milk from a dairy cow. And so, but goats test fence. Oh man, you're going to have to build some crazy industrial strength fence for goats. Sheep will be a little easier, but sheep are oftentimes also referred to as range maggots. They're they can destroy land through their hooves, but it's kind of like, it's the pigs are even worse in that respect. So in many ways, cattle are like the best, but uh, goats and sheep are definitely a possibility in that realm.
And they would require less than the 80 acres to do
Yeah,
your fully off the land, no
correct.
outside input
I
system.
think I think with goats or sheep, you would probably be fine with something closer to 20 acres. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Next on my list, I had location. Um, so, um, and then kind of four subcategories of that are building codes, hopefully lack thereof, or the non-enforcement of that. Uh, Within an hour of a city, within 30 minutes of a nice town, and I had that was from your article, and then I had my own little thing about the edge effect of being in a poor county, rich county. So we can start with building codes, which is a fun topic.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I think, I mean, an interesting thing is that before buying the property that I'm on now, there was something was told to me. Not only they're building codes, and it's like when the real estate agent showed me this particular property, base camp, then she was telling me about her sister had this modification done to her sister. Her sister had a modification done to her home, the sister's home, and it was the bay window thing. Did a bay window, and it's apparently a package. Like you can go to the Home Depot, and it's like, oh, here's this bay window kit, and so the sister hired a dude to put it in, and so thought it was great. So then the real estate agent, the woman who uh, was trying to sell me this property, she explained that here she is in this county, which is different than Missoula County, and had the exact same person put in the exact same kit, and the total cost was half because of building codes. Now, keep in mind the story I told you earlier about Mike Oehler's neighbor. Um,
Right.
it's like that's because there's a lack of codes in the area that the neighbor could legally dump shit along the fence line, just open, just
And
you know,
that's, yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure.
yeah,
Um, I'm on the understanding and that things like septic tanks and when it comes to human waste, that the codes are pretty much statewide, and even counties that don't have building codes still have codes about human waste.
yep, yes. Now, a good now one of the other things that I was told is that as while exploring the many different counties that are near Missoula County, there were some counties where they had no building codes, but they did have a building code enforcement department.
Hmm.
And it's like, what? That doesn't make any
What are they
sense.
enforcing?
Exactly. And so it turns out that if you build something, then people from this office will come to your home and then they will cite you for having violated imaginary building codes.
Oh wow.
But usually how it works is like this. They come to your home and then the first thing they want to get an idea of is, did you, in the most recent election, did you vote for the right people or did you vote for the wrong people? If you voted for the wrong people, well, here's your citation. And you're going to be fined $10,000 a day until you fix it. And they're like, that's not even a law. Yes, it is. Prove it. So you get to go to court. And then, by the way, while you're in court, they found 7 other things that they're citing you for. And it's not that you're violating building codes or that there are building codes. It's that we don't like your type around here. That's what it's for.
Yeah.
And so you're going to be driven out. And all right, so it's like all I'm trying to do is to tell you that there's places where there's building codes and they adhere to the building codes, and it's they're backing it legitimately. And then each person from the Department of Making You Sad could be decent or they might not be. And good luck. You're on your own.
Yeah. So the trick is to just be kind of invisible.
Kinda. There's a lot to be said for that. And so when I lived
Put
on
in your
Mount
berms
Spokane,
first.
yeah, when I lived on Mount Spokane, there was only one person who could even see onto my property, and it was that guy with the horses that had the fucked up hooves who called the Department of Making You Sad on everybody. So I got lots of visits from all the different departments. I got to learn so much. And when the people would come out, you could kind of tell that they were annoyed. Like they had other things they needed to be doing that were like legit, but the call was put in, they have to do their thing, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. I can't even remember. I've kind of gone off on a tangent here. What is?
I've got it in front of me. We were talking about no building codes or lax or unenforced building codes.
If you're looking on the West Coast, I think you're going to encounter a higher rate of code enforcement due to just the population density is going to be higher there.
I think so.
About Washington, they typically are talking about they want to move to the West Coast of Washington, or same with Oregon, right? When they be in that Cascadia area.
Yeah.
So you have a higher population in general. I know for Washington State, they had, I'm trying to think of what it was called now, but they had this settlement that had to do with putting in wells for residential use, that up to a point, you could always put in a well on a property if it was for your personal residential use. And I guess the population density was so high in this one county that the county said, no, we're going to challenge that in court because eventually you're lowering that water table more and more and more to where all the people who did have wells, they're now no longer deep enough and they don't have water. And so I can't remember the name of it now, but it might have been Hertz but essentially this statewide law went into place saying that no, you no longer have the default or de facto right to install a residential well on a property that you purchase, that it first has to be analyzed to make sure that you're not going to affect the water table. And so that was specifically due to the West Coast. You would think with all the rain that they get in most places in that area that it wouldn't be an issue, but it is. So it's something to consider as well, that if you don't have a well on the property you're looking at, you might not be allowed to install one. And so when it comes to code enforcement, I think you'll run into a higher rate of compliance needed. Even if you are able to hide, like you said, all it takes is one person, even if they didn't see something, claiming they did and calling something in, and then somebody is now on your property walking it to see what they can find. So, getting the permission versus, doing it and dealing with it after the fact could be a problem.
I want to add a thing that you just said there, and it's like somebody making the call, reporting something even if it's not true. And I gotta say, I'll bet you that 90% of the calls that are made are not true. And it's kind of like I think that I mean, and they're complaint driven. The Department of Making, you said, is complaint driven.
Yes.
And the complaint is going to be something like, I saw them, ripping apart babies to make nuclear weapons. And, and it's like, who knows what they actually saw, but it doesn't matter. It's like, wow, that sounds very serious. We got to go check it out. Ripping apart babies to make nuclear weapons. That sounds bad in like several different levels. And so I think that the thing is that even if what you're doing is perfectly legal and above board, that doesn't matter. The call will still be made. The key is that what you want them to see nothing at all. Because if they see you out there with a scythe, then it gets called in. If they see you out there with a chainsaw, it gets called in. If they see you out there doing anything at all, it gets called in. And you're thinking like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Doesn't matter. It's 100 based upon the crazy in the head of the person making the call. That's it. It's not rational. It's not reasonable. It's not decent. It's based on crazy people calling. That is the foundation of the system. And so what you want is, you don't want to inspire the crazy, really, right?
Right.
And so another thing is it's like, oh, along the border, I'm going to plant trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs are not nearly as good at soundproofing as a berm.
Right.
Now, we could make a full podcast about sound stuff. But also another thing is the visual. So I told you about that place over in Washington State on the dirt road where those guys would, drive their trucks, loud trucks, very fast by that road.
Yeah.
And we would get a big cloud of dust coming onto us every time they would do that. Bunch of trees right up next to the road, conifers. So year round, but it's like, it didn't stop the noise at all, nor did it stop the dust. So berms, baby, berms. Berm is the word. So, all right. I want to make a suggestion about our format. I love the idea that we get to go into infinite detail on all of these topics and make sure that we have said everything that we want to say about it. At the same time, my bladder is telling me that it's either time for a break or it's time to finish recording for today. And then we could pick it up again next week.
Okay. We're about halfway through my notes, at least.
So how about if we try again next week? Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else either of you want to squeeze in before we go? Nope.
Nope.
All right. If you like this sort of thing, come on out to the forums at permies.com. We talk about becoming a brand new homesteader, homesteading, and permaculture all the time.
All the time.
All